A glimpse of the early beginnings of the Bayombong United Methodist Church. Methodist missionaries preached in Bayombong as early as 1907, almost 9 years after the first evangelical sermon was delivered by Bishop James M. Taborn at the Ascariaga Theater in Manila. But the first converts were baptized on October 31, 1916. The Gospel Jubilee, which marked the baptism of the first converts, was held on May 30, 1965, coincidentally marking also the ministerial witness of the Reverend Mariano L. Hines, who had been our longest-serving pastor. Methodism reached this part of the country through the zeal of the Reverend Dr. Ridos and Dr. Charles Bernhardt, the earliest American missionaries who came to Cagayan Valley via Apari, Cagayan. Later on, Dr. Brent O. Peterson, District Superintendent of Pangasinan, came with Pastor Mauricio Loria and other missionaries to sustain mission work in what is now the modern provinces of Pangasinan, Zambales, Nueva Vizcaya, and Quirino. The guidance of the Holy Spirit enabled them to win the friendship, admiration, and acceptance of the old Servando Gelasio, a barrio leader who opened his heart and house for the preaching of the gospel. Although it was hard for them to invite the barrio people due to their indifference to the Protestants who were usually branded as heretics, there were those who regularly attended the preaching and Bible studies conducted by Pastor Loria. The continuous visitation of Dr. Brent O. Peterson intensified the preaching of the Lord's Gospel in La Torre and Bayombong proper. Through their fiery spirit, God led them to spread the gospel as far as Solano, Bintawan, Morong, and Bambang. The converts of La Torre under the leadership of Mrs. Francisca Silanchon regularly visited Morong. They led to the feet of the Lord Apo Cosme A. Afalia, who later donated a portion of his land to the Morong and Pagabag Methodist churches. His daughter Emilia graduated from Harris Memorial Training School in 1925 and was among the earliest deaconesses to serve in the area. Mrs. Lanchon's house was the regular place of worship in Bayombong. Therein gathered the early converts for Bible classes, who likewise became the nucleus of Methodist believers in the entire province of Nueva Vizcaya. Evangelism and education were the twin emphases of the church. The impact of the preaching of Dr. Peterson, Pastor M. Loria, Pastor Felipe Marquez, and other lay preachers brought about new converts among the elite in the poblacion of Bayombong, such as Roy D. Bennett, a Thomasite American educator, and his wife, who were baptized as members of the Bayombong Methodist Church in 1924. Soon, the Sunday worship services were transferred to a humble bamboo chapel which was constructed on a lot donated by Mr. and Mrs. Fernando C. Gawan. The Sunday school classes were organized and many came to attend. A ministry to students was opened using the building where Mrs. Carmelita B. Dumlao's house is now located as a meeting place for Bible studies. Historically important also was the construction of the Gray Stone Chapel, conceived by Miss Wilhelmina Herbs, the first lady missionary assigned in Nueva Vizcaya. With its indefatigable motto, "Live to learn, learn to live," the chapel served as a student training center on Tuesdays and Thursdays after classes. A dormitory for girls and lady teachers was also started, the Wilhelmina Herbs Girls Dormitory, which served as a home away from home and is now the present site of the United Methodist Christian School. The linguistic and musical talents of Reverend Laureano Marie and Reverend Gregorio Vergara added another historical milestone in the production of a Gadang hymnal which was circulated among the converts through the concerted efforts of Mr. and Mrs. Luis Dangilan, Madame Domingo Cristobal, Vidal Cabawatan, Agustia Di Madela, Fidela Abesamis, Aleja C. Rojas, Emilia Toquero Afalia Gawan, and Messrs. Ambrosio Abesamis, Manuel Fernandez, Vicente Cham Gawan Sr. The compassionate zeal of these leaders brought more soul to Jesus in La Torre, Bayombong, Murong, Bintawan, Bonfal, Bambang, and Macju. The crowded worship services and growing membership necessitated bigger church facilities. In anticipation of this, the old church lot donated by Mr. and Mrs. Fernando Sigawan was sold, and with the proceeds, together with a sizable amount donated by the members, a bigger lot with a 2-story building was purchased from Assemblyman Wenceslao Valera through the intercession of Roy D. Bennett. This is the present site of the church, which faces the old provincial capitol building, now a museum. The ground floor of this 2-story building was used as a place of worship, while the upper floors served as the parsonage for some years. A final plan to construct a permanent church building was approved during the quarterly conference of the church board held on October 5, 1935 and presided by Reverend Mariano L. Hines, newly appointed district superintendent. Another enduring mark in our church history took place when the kindergarten work was started by Miss Anita Quisha, who was the deaconess of the church. In the same year, the children's department was constructed with Reverend Aniceto U. Jerusalem, then as newly appointed pastor. The members next pursued the construction of the new church edifice. The leadership of Attorney Eliodoro Benitez, chairman of the Board of Trustees, and the cooperation of the lady, Dr. and Mrs. Baltazar Carginalla, husband-wife teams of Ernesto Quisha, Salvador Rojas, Eugenio Tolentino, Siriaco Fabian, Juan Jimenez, Nathaniel Alvarez, Leodegario Magtira, Ambrosio Abesamis, Pablo Lanchon, Vicente Texon, Engineer and Mrs. A. Talo, Attorney Guillermo E. Bongolan, Dr. Roman Rimorin, Reverend and Mrs. Hines, Reverend and Mrs. Jerusalem, Mrs. Asterio Saki, Mr. S. Caljo, and the Marsans saw themselves hauling stones, gravel, and sand with their bull carts. Mr. Benito Tumaliwan was master carpenter, and Apo Fernando Sigawan and their children Vicenta Sr. and others donated first-class timber posts for the building. The first foundation stone for the building was laid in a fitting ceremony on July 3, 1937 in the presence of Dr. and Mrs. Ernest Stock and Dr. and Mrs. Brent O. Peterson. More aid came after the visit of Bishop Edwin F. Lee. An unforgettable gift of Dr. and Mrs. Charles Bernhardt of 1,200 pesos surprised the members that they too vowed to give more. Mr. Domingo Baluyan, a retired public school teacher, recounted, "The construction was completed in 1939, which the first Northern Philippines Annual Conference used in the valley. It is regretted, however, that the beautiful church building did not last long, for it was destroyed during the Second World War. For church reconstruction, the church applied for assistance from the Mission Board through Dr. Ernest E. Talk, for which the amount of 20,000 pesos for church building and 5,000 pesos for parsonage was granted. Since then, the church building had undergone renovations. In addition to building improvement, several innovations in church worship and practices had been implemented, the most notable of which Reverend Mariano Hines, our pastor emeritus, introduced. The cross was adopted in 1939, Harvest Festival in 1947, services at the cemetery every November 1st, pre-Christmas morning services, the use of the candles in 1957, and the display of the Philippine and Christian flags in the church sanctuary, a donation by Attorney and Mrs. Guillermo E. Bongolan. Methodism in Bayombong responded to critical issues affecting church and society. It opposed the bill on compulsory religious instruction in the public schools, which was endorsed to the National Assembly on April 24, 1938. Other resolutions favorable to the improvement of social services and regeneration of morals have also been made. The membership of the church in 1938, which included the barangays or villages of Bonfal and Busilak, was 387 with an annual budget of 316 pesos. When church members from Bonfal and Busilak formed their respective churches in 1974, the membership of the United Methodist Church of Bayombong was 517 members with an annual budget of 22,000 pesos. After the Second World War, a flurry of physical developments occurred with the following highlights. The renovation and expansion of the educational building under the able leadership of Engineer Nicanor Martinez, assisted by the overall chairman on projects, Teofilo G. Guillermo. The painting of the whole church building with the 50% counterpart of Attorney Jose D. Calderon and Vice Governor Betty Calderon. The permanent renovation of the chancel and the sanctuary under the chairmanship of Pedro F. Fabian and the assistance of Teofilo G. Guillermo, chairman of the Board of Trustees. Macario de Dufalsa and Engineer Alfredo Domingo, who also donated the amount necessary for its painting. The total improvements costing 18,000 pesos was raised by the members of the church themselves with Reverend Benjamin A. Justo, a resident minister, and the then district superintendent, Reverend Francisco C. Galam. These were all done to provide a better place for worship and prepare for the hosting of the Northeast Philippines Annual Conference on May 26 to 30, 1971. From the 1980s to the new millennium, as part of renovation and construction activities ensued, the most notable of which were erection of the Calata Hall costing 150,000 pesos donated by Froilan Papailan Calata and Mrs. Dolores Mamalu Calata in 1984. Renovation and expansion of the kindergarten building in 1989. Renovation of the dormitory building and its conversion into a school in 1993. Construction of a new church building started in 2001. It is estimated to cost 20 million pesos, out of which 12 million pesos had been raised as of 2012. Through the years, the dynamism of the church council and the dedication and sacrifices of the church members have ensured that the spiritual, social, and material goals of the church are achieved. The church council have been faithfully led by the following chairpersons. 1959, Teofilo Gavina Guillermo. 1960 to 1969, Froilan Bayawa Calata. 1970 to 1980, Pedro Fabian Fabiana. 1981 to 1984, Froilan Bayawa Calata. 1985 to 1989, Perfecto Bulyoser Martinez Jr. 1990 to 1995, Mrs. Lourdes Robles Galam. 1996 to 2014, Junifen Franco Gawan. 2015 to present, Nathanael B. Vidad.